Hello, my friend. Today, you are going to learn English by talking about something that I believe is one of the most misunderstood experiences in all of language learning. Something that millions of people feel but that almost no one explains clearly. Something that makes people question their own intelligence, their own memory, their own fundamental capacity to learn. The experience is this. You can understand English perfectly well. You can watch a film and follow the story. You can listen to a podcast and understand most of what is being said. You can read an article and comprehend every paragraph. You know what words mean when you hear them. You recognize grammar structures when you see them. Your understanding is real and it is growing. But the moment someone asks you to speak, the moment the English needs to move from the inside to the outside, from receiving to producing, from passive to active, something breaks down. The words are not there. Or they are there, but they will not come out. Or they come out wrong, in the wrong order, at the wrong speed, with the wrong grammar, and the experience is so frustrating and so confusing that you begin to wonder whether you are broken in some way that other people are not. You are not broken. What you are experiencing has a name, an explanation, and a solution. And today we are going to go through all three together. Let me start with a story. When I was in the early years of my English learning, riding my bicycle every morning to the hotel where the tourists stayed, I had a period that I remember with great clarity and great frustration. My listening had grown faster than my speaking. I could understand quite a lot of what the tourists said to me. I could follow conversations between native speakers that I was not even part of, understanding the words, the meaning, the humor, the emotion. My ear was developing, but my mouth was not keeping pace. When I tried to speak, the English that was so available to me as a listener became unavailable to me as a speaker. I would reach for a word I had heard hundreds of times and it would not come. I would try to construct a sentence and the structure would collapse in the middle. I would start speaking and then stop, start again, stop again, feeling the gap between what I wanted to say and what I was actually saying as a physical frustration, like trying to pour water through a hole that was too small. I did not understand what was happening at the time. I thought I was simply not practicing enough, or not studying enough, or not trying hard enough. I blamed myself for a gap that was not actually a personal failure at all. It was a structural reality of language learning that nobody had explained to me. And I want to explain it to you now, clearly and completely, so that you can stop blaming yourself and start doing the things that will actually close the gap. The explanation begins with a distinction that is fundamental to understanding language acquisition. The distinction between receptive language and productive language. Receptive language is everything you can understand, the words you recognize when you hear them, the grammar you can parse when you see it, the meaning you can extract from spoken or written English. Productive language is everything you can generate, the words you can retrieve and speak, the grammar you can assemble in real time, the sentences you can construct spontaneously under social pressure. These two systems are related, but they are not the same. They are built differently, stored differently, retrieved differently, and developed through different kinds of practice. And crucially, they grow at different rates. Almost universally, in almost every language learner, receptive language grows faster than productive language. Your understanding almost always runs ahead of your speaking. This is not a sign of imbalance or failure. It is the normal, expected, entirely natural trajectory of language acquisition. Think about how this same pattern appears in other domains of skill. A person who has listened to music their entire life develops a sophisticated ear for musical quality. They can hear immediately when something is off, when a note is wrong, when a performance is technically correct but emotionally empty. Their receptive musical ability is high. But if you sit them down at a piano and ask them to play, their hands do not know where to go. The ear and the hands are different systems. The ear has been trained by years of listening. The hands have not been trained at all. This is not surprising. No one would be surprised by this. And yet when the same pattern appears in language learning, when the ear understands far more than the mouth can produce, people treat it as a personal failure rather than a predictable feature of how human skill development works. Your receptive English and your productive English are like your ear and your hands at that piano. One has been trained more than the other. The training that built your understanding was largely passive, listening, reading, absorbing. The training that will build your speaking is active, producing, constructing, attempting. And if you have been doing significantly more passive training than active training, the gap between your understanding and your speaking is not a mystery. It is arithmetic. But I want to go deeper than this. Because the understanding speaking gap is not just about the quantity of passive versus active practice. There are specific psychological and neurological reasons why productive language is so much harder than receptive language, and understanding these reasons will help you approach the problem with the right tools rather than just more effort in the wrong direction. The first reason is what researchers call retrieval difficulty. When you are listening to English and you hear a word, the brain's job is recognition. It needs to match the incoming sound to a stored pattern. Recognition is a relatively easy cognitive task. The word arrives fully formed, and the brain simply needs to identify it, the way you identify a face you have seen before. But when you are speaking English and you need to produce a word, the brain's job is retrieval. It needs to find the word in memory and bring it to the surface without any external prompt. Retrieval is a much harder cognitive task than recognition. This is why you can recognize a word immediately when you hear it, but be completely unable to produce it when you need it. The word is in your memory, but the pathway from the need to the word is not yet strong enough to carry the retrieval reliably under the pressure of real-time speaking. This is also why studying vocabulary through recognition exercises, matching words to definitions, identifying the correct word in a multiple-choice question does not build productive vocabulary as efficiently as production exercises do. Recognition practice builds recognition pathways. Production practice builds production pathways. If you want to be able to retrieve a word when you are speaking, you need to practice retrieving it, actually producing it, in sentences, out loud, in contexts, as close as possible to the real speaking situations where you will need it. The second reason the gap exists is the time pressure of speaking. When you are reading or listening, you control the pace of the input, at least to some degree. You can reread a sentence. You can pause a podcast. You can take the time you need to process what you are encountering. But when you are speaking, the clock does not stop. The conversation is moving in real time. The other person is waiting. The social context creates pressure that does not exist in passive language consumption. And under that pressure, the brain's productive language system, which is already slower and less reliable than the receptive system, is asked to perform at exactly the moment when the conditions are least favorable to it. This time pressure is one of the primary reasons people freeze when they try to speak English. The gap between the speed at which they can process incoming English and the speed at which they can produce outgoing English becomes visible in real time, as pauses and hesitations and sentences that start and stop and restart. And the awareness of this gap, the experience of watching yourself struggle while the other person waits, generates anxiety that makes the gap even wider. Anxiety consumes cognitive resources. A brain that is partly occupied with monitoring its own performance and feeling bad about what it observes has fewer resources available for the actual work of producing language. The anxiety and the gap feed each other, creating a cycle that can feel very difficult to break. The third reason is what I think of as the assembly problem. When you understand English, the grammar is already assembled for you. The sentences arrive complete and you simply receive them. But when you produce English, you have to assemble the grammar yourself in real time from components, subject, verb, object, tense, aspect, mood, number, all of it, while simultaneously managing the content of what you are trying to say and the social context in which you are saying it. This simultaneous management of multiple complex systems is an extraordinary cognitive demand. It is genuinely hard, and it is hard in ways that passive understanding completely conceals, which is why people who are good at understanding are so often shocked by how hard speaking is. Understanding gave them no preparation for the assembly problem because understanding requires no assembly at all. Now I want to turn to what you can actually do about this. Because understanding the gap is valuable, but solving the gap is what you are here for. And I want to be specific and concrete, because the general advice to just practice speaking more is true but insufficient. Speaking more is necessary, but it is the particular kind of speaking practice that makes the difference, and I want to describe that to you precisely. The most important thing you can do to close the understanding speaking gap is to practice retrieval, not recognition, retrieval. This means actively trying to produce language that you have only passively received, forcing your brain to find words and structures in memory rather than simply recognizing them when they arrive. One of the most powerful ways to do this is something I call the recall and reproduce practice. Take any English content you have recently consumed, A podcast episode, a film scene, an article, a conversation you were part of. Immediately after consuming it, without looking at any text, try to reproduce the main ideas in English, out loud, in your own words. Not a perfect retelling, not a memorized recitation. Just your own spontaneous attempt to produce in English what you just received in English, using whatever vocabulary and structures you can retrieve in the moment. This practice is uncomfortable because the retrieval is genuinely difficult. Words that were perfectly clear when you heard them a few minutes ago will not come when you try to produce them. Structures that you understood completely when you read them will collapse when you try to assemble them yourself. This difficulty is not failure. This difficulty is the training. Every time you reach for a word and it is not immediately there, and you search for it and you find it, or you find a different word that works instead, you are strengthening a retrieval pathway. You are making that word more available to production, not just to recognition. You are moving vocabulary from passive to active, from receptive to productive, from understood to owned. I want to tell you about something specific that I did during that period when my understanding was running far ahead of my speaking. I started what I think of as the translation practice, but not translation in the direction most people think of, not from English into my native language, from my thoughts into English. I would have a thought, a fully formed, complex, nuanced thought in my native language. And then I would make myself express that thought in English, out loud, alone, without anyone listening. Not translating word by word, which produces stilted, unnatural English, but finding the English equivalent of the whole thought, the English way of saying what I meant, using the vocabulary and structures I had absorbed through my listening and reading. This practice was extremely difficult at first. The thoughts that were simple in my native language became stumbling, approximate, frustrating productions in English, but it was exactly this difficulty that made it valuable. I was forcing the productive system to engage with content that the receptive system had already processed. Training retrieval with the full cognitive load of real thought rather than the simplified content of language exercises. Over weeks and then months, I noticed that the English was coming more readily. That thoughts which had taken 30 seconds of struggle to produce in English were taking 10 seconds, then 5, then arriving almost simultaneously with the thought itself. The gap between thinking and speaking was closing. Not because my English understanding had improved, that was already strong, but because my English production had been trained through months of this particular kind of effortful practice. I also want to talk about something that is deeply practical and immediately usable, which is the set of strategies for managing the gap in real conversation while you are working to close it over the long term. Because the gap exists right now, and you have conversations right now, and you need tools for those conversations that do not require you to have already solved the problem before you can participate. The most important strategy is to make friends with speaking slowly. Most people with a strong understanding speaking gap try to speak at a speed that they cannot sustain, the speed of their understanding, which is relatively fast rather than the speed of their production, which is relatively slow. This mismatch creates the experience of running out of language in the middle of a sentence, of starting confidently and then stalling, which is one of the most discouraging experiences in speaking. Give yourself permission to speak slowly, deliberately, with pauses. Pauses are not signs of inadequacy. They are signs of a person who is thinking carefully about what they are saying. Native speakers pause. Good speakers pause. The pause is your production system doing its work, and it deserves the time it needs. The second strategy is the rephrasing habit. When the exact word you need does not come, do not stop and wait for it. Move around it. Find another way to express the same idea using words that are more available to you. If the word frustrated will not come, say not happy, or difficult for me, or it bothered me. If the word conversation will not come, say talking with someone, or when we spoke, or our discussion. This rephrasing habit serves two purposes simultaneously. It keeps the conversation moving, which maintains your confidence and the other person's engagement. And it trains the production system to be flexible, to find multiple routes to the same destination, which is itself a component of fluency. The third strategy is chunked speaking. Rather than trying to construct long, complex sentences under pressure, break your speaking into shorter, simpler units, one idea per sentence. Simple sentences joined by and, but, and, because rather than complex embedded structures. Not because simple sentences are inferior, they are not. but because short, complete, clear sentences delivered with confidence are far more effective communication than long, complex, halting sentences that collapse in the middle. As your production system develops, your sentences will naturally become longer and more complex, but in the meantime, simple and complete is always better than complex and broken. I want to say something now about the role of reading aloud in closing the understanding-speaking gap, because it is a practice that is severely underused and that has a particular power for people in exactly this situation. Reading aloud is one of the few activities that engages both the receptive and the productive language systems simultaneously. When you read aloud, your eye receives the text, receptive processing, while your mouth produces it, productive processing, in real time. The words that your receptive system knows are being processed at the same moment that your productive system is producing them, creating a direct connection between the two systems that silent reading and silent listening cannot create. Find English content that you find genuinely interesting and read it aloud for 10 minutes every day. Not quickly, not mechanically, but carefully and expressively, as though you were speaking to a real audience. Pay attention to how the words feel in your mouth. Notice which words are physically comfortable to produce and which are awkward, and spend extra time on the awkward ones. Over weeks of this practice, you will begin to notice that words you know from reading and listening start to feel familiar in your mouth as well, not just in your ear and in your eye. The productive system is absorbing them. The gap is beginning to close from that direction too. There is something else I want to address directly. Something that underlies the understanding-speaking gap for many people, even when they would not name it this way. It is the belief, usually unconscious, that speaking is a test. That every time you open your mouth in English, your performance is being evaluated and a verdict is being rendered. Not just about your English, but about your intelligence, your education, your worth as a person. This belief transforms every conversation into an examination. And examinations are not the same as practice. Examinations create a performance anxiety that shuts down exactly the creative, flexible, risk-taking mental space that productive language requires. You cannot speak fluently when you are taking a test. You can only speak fluently when you are having a conversation. The antidote to this belief is not to tell yourself that speaking is not a test that is too direct a contradiction of a deeply held assumption to be effective through sheer assertion. The antidote is to accumulate evidence that conversations are conversations and not tests. Evidence that comes from having enough real conversations where the other person was not evaluating you, where mistakes did not produce judgment, where the imperfect English was sufficient for genuine communication, where something real and warm and human happened despite all the gaps and errors. This evidence takes time to accumulate, but every real conversation you have is adding to it. Every time you speak imperfect English and the world does not end, and the other person understands you, and the connection happens anyway, your brain records that evidence. And evidence, accumulated in sufficient quantity, changes beliefs more reliably than any affirmation. I want to tell you something that I have come to believe very deeply about the understanding-speaking gap specifically, something that goes beyond technique and method. The gap between understanding English and speaking English is, at its deepest level, the gap between receiving and giving, between taking in and putting out, between consuming and creating. And this gap is not only a linguistic phenomenon, it is a human one. Many people are far more comfortable receiving than giving, far more comfortable observing than participating, far more comfortable understanding what is happening than contributing to what happens. The English-speaking problem is sometimes, underneath the technical explanation, an expression of a broader discomfort with being present, with being visible, with adding your voice to a conversation that is already happening without you. I do not say this to diagnose you or to suggest that something is wrong with you if you recognize yourself in this description. I say it because I think it is important to see the full picture of what you are working on when you work on speaking English. You are not only training a language skill, you are practicing a way of being in the world. The practice of opening your mouth and putting your thoughts into the air imperfectly and honestly in a language that is not yet fully yours is the practice of showing up, of claiming your place in the conversation, of saying with every word you speak that your voice belongs here even when it is imperfect, that what you think and feel and believe deserves to be heard even when the grammar is wrong, that you are here and you are real and you have something to say. That practice extends far beyond English. It extends into every relationship, every professional situation, every moment in your life where silence is easier than speaking, and where the choice to speak anyway is an act of genuine courage. And every time you make that choice in English, with all its difficulty, with all its imperfection, you are strengthening not just your language, but your character. Not just your vocabulary, but your voice. Not just your English brain, but your entire relationship with the idea that you have the right to be heard. I close with this. The gap between understanding and speaking is real. It is not your imagination. It is not a sign of stupidity or laziness or inadequate effort. It is a structural feature of language acquisition that every learner faces, that every fluent speaker once faced, and that every single one of them closed, not by waiting for it to close, not by studying their way across it, but by speaking, by producing, by putting imperfect English into the air, over and over and over again, until the productive system caught up with the receptive system, until the hands learned what the ears already knew, until the mouth became as fluent in English as the mind had always been. Your mouth is learning. It is slower than your mind. It needs more practice, more patience, more of the specific, active, productive training that passive learning cannot provide. Give it that training. Every day, in small, imperfect, courageous doses. And trust that what your mind already knows, your mouth is learning to say. The understanding is already there. The speaking is on its way. Keep going. It is closer than it feels.